Jim Harold's Crime Scene is brought to you by Scott Evest. Great clothing plus tons of pockets for your stuff. Well, that's Scott Evest. To learn more and get a super special Scott Evest deal, go to jimharold.com/vest. That's jimharold.com/vest. Click on the link I provide there and use the coupon code JimHarold and you'll get 20% off your purchase. That's one word, Jim Harold, and get 20% off your purchase. Thanks, Scott Evest. The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold and so glad to be with you. And today we're going to take a look back. We're going to take a look back to the turn of the previous century to talk about a forgotten true story of a Robin Hood of the American frontier who pulled off the first successful kidnapping for ransom in U.S. history. And the novel based on that true story, and we have the perfect guest for that because we have the author of World Chase Me Down, Andrew Hillman, who is the author of said book, and he was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. He earned his BA and MA in English at Creighton University and his MFA in fiction from Northern Michigan University. During his time in graduate school, he taught creative writing, composition, and technical writing. He's been published in Fiddlehead Magazine and was a finalist for Glimmer Train's Short Fiction Award. This is his debut novel, World Chase Me Down, just published by Penguin in January of this year, and he lives in Omaha with his wife and daughter. Andrew, welcome to the program today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So, I mean, sitting here in 2017, what inspired you to go back to 1900 and write a novel based on this true story?
Well, I've always been fascinated with Omaha's history because it's a violent history, and you wouldn't assume that if you lived in the city today and you didn't know much about how it came to be. But I didn't start in 1900. I actually started in the 1930s, and I was researching another violent character from Omaha's past, Tom Denison. He was Omaha's political boss for the first 30 years of the 20th century, and I was writing a novel about him. And in my research, writing that book, I kept coming across tidbits of stories of Pat Crow, who is the main character and kidnapper in World Chase Me Down. And I kept thinking, wow, what a great story. I really want to tell this story. And the Tom Denison novel was not very good. It was pretty bad. I was still really kind of earning my chops as a writer. But I finished it, and I just knew I wanted to move on rather than spend more time revising something that just wasn't going to pan out. So once I finally did, I already had a lot of research about Omaha at that time, and I just started to run with it at that point.
So talk to us about who was the real Pat Crow.
Well, the real Pat Crow, kind of an enigma. There are differing stories in history, and some of the history contradicts itself, especially from his point of view, because he left behind an old autobiography from like 1923 that was really hard to track down. They gave a first-person account of his life, and some of that stuff differed from what was reported in the newspapers, and even some of the things that different newspapers reported contradicted itself. So it's hard to pin down, but I mean, the general gist is he was a butcher in Omaha, and he had worked for the Edward Cudahy packing house for quite some time, and he finally decided to start up his own butcher shop, and he got ran out of business. It was big business, Cudahy, smashing small business, which is a story that we see a lot today, and he lost everything. He lost his job, he lost his business, his wife left him. He had nothing, and he kind of fell into crime almost by accident. He started robbing banks and trains, and in a few years' time became pretty famous. The FBI didn't have a top 10 most wanted back then. There wasn't even an FBI back then, as a matter of fact. But he swore his revenge on Cudahy, thinking that he was the one who was personally responsible for Pat's failure, and he decided to come back to Omaha in 1900 with his friend and partner, and they kidnapped Edward Cudahy's son in December of 1900 for $25,000 in ransom. And I guess the simplest thing to say about the story, if the book had a tagline, it would be, it's the first successful ransom for kidnapping in the history of the United States.
So, I mean, to even come up with this plot was pretty audacious and ambitious, even though if it was towards a criminal end like kidnapping, it was pretty bold.
Well, a lot of the plot elements were there already. They'd happened because, I mean, the kidnapping was true. The 5-year-long manhunt for him after that he got away with the kidnapping really happened. And once he finally turned himself in Montana when he was destitute and homeless, and brought back to Nebraska, this big circus trial that happened for the kidnapping was true. So for me, it wasn't so much about creating the plot elements as it was organizing them on the page to tell the story in a thrilling way. And everything else, I stayed as true to those 3 main parts of the story as I could, and everything else had to be filled in with fiction. So that's why it's kind of a blend. It's about, I mean, I can't boil it down to percentage, but I would say it's pretty close to half and half the truth, half fiction.
Now, this is interesting to me for somebody who does what you do. I would find it daunting enough to try to write a novel about something that's happened in the last 20, 30, 40 years while I've been around. But at least I have some touchstones. I wrote a novel about the 1980s. I was alive in the 1980s, so I could probably get a lot of the details right. How in the world do you take yourself back to 1900 and get the details right and the feel and the zeitgeist and all of that? I mean, that would seem to be one of the most daunting parts. How did you tackle that?
Well, for me, it was the most enjoyable. That's what really kept my interest going as a writer and really fueled the day-to-day grind of the work was I loved doing the research. I think it just takes a certain personality of someone where for example, I probably researched twice as much as I actually did writing for the book. 2/3 of my time was probably research, and the last third was probably writing, which I don't know if that's normal or not for a historical novelist, but I just really, even on days that I found stuff that I wasn't going to be able to use in the book, I was enjoying the process anyway. And if you don't enjoy the research aspect, then you shouldn't write historical fiction. You should stick to what you have lived through or what's recent. But that really was the fuel that drove it because it was so interesting to me because you're discovering things. You're discovering even small stuff, little phrases that people used back then, the colors of women's dresses, how life was in Omaha, and you kind of recreate it from scratch. And I think it's probably attuned to the same feeling that a science fiction novelist or a fantasy novelist would have, where you have to world build. You create an entire world from scratch. And I think I felt that as a historical novelist, and that was pretty exciting.
Well, I mean, to me, it would be something as simple as in the details, he walked into the saloon and ordered a whiskey for a dime, or, I mean, I don't know how much a shot of whiskey cost in 1900. I mean, even something like that, to get it right, that would be something that you would have to research and try to nail down. So it could be daunting. So it's got to be a good thing that you like the process.
Right. And the other thing I did too was, as much as I wanted to get everything, I wanted to be as period accurate as possible, I also wasn't a slave to being 100% true because I knew this was historical fiction and some of the aspects of the story itself were going to be made up. So what I wanted to do more so was, instead of worrying about every single little detail being exactly right, which I did in a lot of cases, but more than anything I wanted to get the feel of 1900 to be honest and feel authentic and otherworldly. And so sometimes you come across something with your imagination, and it sounds like it would be right, but I didn't know if it was or not, and I didn't really worry with myself with that too much. So if you were, say, a really devout historian, you could probably page the book and find a little inaccuracy here or there, something, that wasn't around exactly at that point in that year, and that doesn't bother me.
But you had the spirit of it right. Now, the character of Pat Crow, it's got to be a challenge to write a, quote, villain as the protagonist, in the sense that, on some level, I would assume you would want some kind of, positive or redeeming qualities. But it sounds like he wasn't just a, quote, bad guy, but it was kind of a mixed bag that he had some redeeming qualities, and some of the things that he did that were heinous, kidnapping a child. I mean, it's not the kid's fault. And obviously I think it's fair to say kidnapping a child is morally wrong. So obviously he had some moral deficiencies in doing something like that. But his reasoning behind it, you could kind of see his point, even though you would hope that you personally wouldn't go that far in getting your revenge. I mean, talk about him. Was he just simply black and white a bad guy, or were there more nuances with him?
Well, I think he's not a villain in the classical sense. The term that's thrown around a lot is anti-hero. I'm not a huge fan of that term either. I don't know I didn't have a label for him. I never considered trying to fit him into a category as a character, because then I think your themes might be a little too obvious to the reader. But I would say that everything he does in the book that might surprise the reader as being evil, even, not just, to say kidnapping a child is morally wrong, it goes beyond that. I mean, it's pure evil. And what kind of a person is capable of pure evil? It's one of the, beyond, murder, it's one of the worst things you could do as a human being. And how do you reconcile that act with a man who does have redeeming qualities about him like Pat does? And I think that everything that he does in the book, even if it's evil or even when he's being his funniest, it all comes from a place of deep agony, his own personal agony. It's not something he relishes, because he's not a psychopath where he doesn't have any kind of moral principle and it's just kind of emptiness at the center. He has all of this pain, and people process pain in different ways, and his goes way beyond what normal people would do. And that's how I thought of him as I was building his character. Instead of saying, oh, he's a villain here, or he's being redeemed here, or he's an anti-hero or a dark character in this way, I just kind of thought about how every action he does, even his best actions as well, still come from a place of deep internal pain.
Our guest is Andrew Hillman. We'll be back on the crime scene right after this. Jim Harold's Crime Scene is brought to you by Scott eVest. Great clothing plus tons of pockets for your stuff. Well, that's Scott eVest. And to learn more and get a super special Scott eVest deal, go to jimharold.com/vest. That's jimharold.com/vest. Click on the link we provide there and use the coupon code JimHarold, one word all smushed together there, Jim Harold, and you'll get 20% off your purchase. And you might ask, well, what is so great about Scott eVest? And I am going to tell you. Now, if you're like me, what do you do if you have tons of stuff to carry around, whether you're just strolling around town or you're traveling or whatever, and you have all these gadgets and gizmos and things and you want them with you, but you have nowhere to put them? Well, that used to be a tough question, but now it's easy because of Scott eVest. Think about carrying all of your stuff without worrying about an extra bag or misplacing anything. Just carry everything right on you, on your person, with a Scott eVest. Now, they have all kinds of clothing, vests, where it all started, jackets, shorts, pants for men, for women, but all of it is super convenient. Now, think about a Scott eVest, for example. I have their Quest vest. Great at the airport. You can just put everything in your vest and just put that through security, let them scan it. No bags to fool around with, no extra baggage charges. Now I think some of the airlines are starting to charge for carry-ons, if I'm not mistaken. Well, you're wearing your bag, essentially, and it looks great. It's stylish, fantastic. And it's great for any kind of travel, air travel or otherwise. You can carry everything from your phone, a bottle of water, and even a full-sized laptop with a Scott eVest. Now, I just got their new packet jacket, Scott's new and improved windbreaker, and perfect for the time of year we're coming up on. In my climate, we just got into spring, and you want to have some kind of windbreaker on. But this is great. And like all the other Scott eVest products, they have a ton of pockets sewn in, and it's fantastic. And just like all of my Scott eVest's pieces of clothing, and I'm building quite a collection now, I love it. So I invite you to do what I did. Discover the power of pockets. Go to jimharold.com/vest. That's jimharold.com/vest. Click on the link I provide there and use the coupon code JimHarold, and you get 20% off your purchase. Thanks, Scott eVest. We're back on the crime scene. Our guest today is Andrew Hillman. We're talking about his recent book, World Chase Me Down. What surprised you about writing this? I mean, whether it was in the process or in the aftermath?
Surprised me about the process. Not a whole lot surprised me about the writing process because this is my fifth novel that I've written. The other four will never see the light of day, and I'm going to make quite sure of that because they're very bad. And it'd be very embarrassing. So, can't even find them on my hard drive. So I've been around the block. I had already written 4 books at this point. I had gone, through 2 master's programs in writing. I knew everything I needed to know. It was just a matter of executing it right for once to get a story right and not have problems that I'd come across before. So the writing process didn't really surprise me. I think what surprised me kind of was what happened after, which was the process of putting it out into the world. Things that I thought about publishing the book that I assumed would be really difficult turned out to be easier, and some things that I thought would be rather easy turned out to be a little more difficult. So I was a little surprised by that, which is perfectly normal for someone who's publishing their book for the first time.
In terms of the action, talk to us about the action in the novel. Certainly that's got to be a part of making something like this thrilling and interesting. How did you deal with that, and how would you describe this in terms of the action? Because I guess in some sense it's a Western. So talk to us about that.
Well, the action, what I wanted to do when there was a scene of action, for example, there's a scene a little later in the book during the manhunt where Pat is escaping these 3 different posses that are made up of, there's a policeman, there's regular people, there's farmers with their hunting guns who have located him in Omaha, and they're tracking him down because there's a $50,000 reward on his head. And he flees and he escapes across the Missouri River while avoiding gunfire. There's a whole bunch of different scenes. There's a lot of action. And the only way I thought to really do it was to do it cinematically, where I wasn't in Pat's head too much. Everything that I put on the page was something that could be translated to the screen almost directly if it were being made into a movie. So every line, every sentence, every piece of dialogue was something that was physically happening. So instead of making it an internal thing, you had to approach the action scenes as if you were writing a really detailed screenplay.
I'm curious about this as a novelist. When you write different characters, if you're writing Pat, or you're writing a sheriff, or you're writing the businessman who had his son kidnapped, do you kind of almost like an actor, do you almost become those characters as you write them and then just switch from character to character? Is that part of the process, or do I have this all wrong?
You're close. For me, it wasn't, because the whole book is told first-person perspective from Pat's point of view. So he's the narrator of the whole story. So I can talk about this is that I didn't so much think of Pat as like an actor taking on the role of him, where I was kind of trying to become him. What I did more so was the opposite, as I was putting and interjecting myself into his character. So baggage that I already had emotionally, things that I had been through, my own opinions about politics and, the big guy versus the small guy, the 99% versus the 1, all these things I have lived through, and I projected that onto Pat. So a lot of my personality is kind of stoked in him, which was therapeutic in a lot of ways. So I guess it's kind of reversed. Now with smaller characters, they were a little bit more difficult because you don't want to have everyone be the very same thing. So for those I took in, those were just created from pure imagination. They were a little bit harder to do. But I try to make them true. My biggest thing was to avoid cliche with every character, because there are a lot of them out there, a lot of cliche traps in the Western genre, and I wanted to avoid all of that. For example, Pat's wife, Hattie, she could have very easily been the damsel in distress or the wife in the dark who doesn't know anything, but she's crude, she's smart, she's a very strong character who is just as witty as Pat is, and also knows more about the underbelly of the city than he does. So she felt like a very fresh character to me for the genre. So that's what I try to do with every character, and then Pat, of course, was a large part of myself in him.
Not saying that you're trying to redeem him, but did you feel a sense of duty to the real Pat Crow when writing this in any way?
Oh, I absolutely did. I think even if you're taking artistic liberties with a character from history who's been long gone for a long time, you do feel responsibility to not totally go off the wall or do something totally different with the character. You try to get what you think he would have been like correct. Now, like I said in the previous question, a large part of his personality is myself, but also because I think that we probably have a lot in common, even though 120 years separate us. Now, of course, I would never, ever consider kidnapping a child or robbing a bank or any of that kind of thing, but I'm talking about the internal workings of what motivated him I shared. So I think we had a lot of common ground in that way, but that also might just be wishful thinking on my part as a novelist. So I don't know if that's kind of a hard question to answer. I think that's about as best as I can give you on that one.
Now, I'm looking here, and I even, do you think this is something? It seems like to me the kind of story that would be made perfectly for a movie. Do you think that's something that might happen down the road?
Well, I think the possibility is very real. I can't really talk about it at this point.
Gotcha.
I would love to talk about like all my ideas and things for it, but I'm just going to kind of leave that there. The one thing I would say to this point is that I wrote the book, like I talked about the action scenes, picturing them cinematically. I did that for a lot of the book too. Another thing I did that I think would make for a great adaptation is a lot of the character in the book is revealed through dialogue. It's not revealed through prose. I really wanted to avoid telling about characters on the page in that kind of way, and I wanted to reveal them piece by piece through what they said and what they did, like you would have to do in a screenplay. That's the only option you have. So I approached it that way. So I think that if there was an adaptation, that would be something that would really help transfer it to the screen more easily than other novels.
We've had other people on the shows talking about things that happened in the early 20th century. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that we're so marked and tinged by our current technology and media kind of environment. But you have to remember in 1900, when all of this went down, there was no television, no radio, certainly no internet, and basically you had newspapers as the prevailing media. Books and newspapers were pretty much it. And then I don't know what the literacy numbers were, but how much of the population could even read at that point. So my question to you is, you talk about a nationwide manhunt, and it was kind of the thrill of the nation. I mean, from what you were able to gather from the historical record, I mean, how did word spread about Pat Crow, and how did it get so big in a time with so much less media?
Well, it was the newspapers. I mean, because like you said, that was all there was. Radio was a good 20 years away, TV even more than that. So, but, I mean, I try to think of it, too. You think, oh, man, only newspapers? Well, think if we only had television. Think of like in the 1980s before we had the internet. Even if we didn't have news, if we just had television, it would still spread. News of something of that caliber would spread pretty quickly, and newspapers did too, because it just wasn't Omaha newspapers. These were national newspapers that were running stories. And newspapers back then, where even the big institutions weren't afraid of leaning towards the side of being tabloid-ish almost. I mean, because there was a lot of yellow journalism back then. So every little rumor, every little thing that could have been reported from a witness didn't really have to be verified. And what they could do is they could really play up, if a story was selling newspapers, they would keep pressing on it. And this manhunt for this kidnapper sold a lot of papers. So at one point, I think the horse that Pat Crow rode on had been reported like as 6 different breeds and colors by certain witnesses, and the papers reported all of that. They reported fact and rumor both. And that just fueled the fire and drove up interest across the nation.
So, I mean, do you think that you're going to continue in this genre? Do you see continuing with kind of the Western genre? Is this a place that you enjoy, or are you going to travel to other areas of history in your writing?
Well, I mean, obviously I very much enjoy Westerns, but I want to move away from it with the next book. And I don't know if I'll ever return to it. I mean, you asked me that same question 5 years from now, and my answer could be very different, but there's a lot of different types of writing I really want to try because I'm a fan of so many. Like I love thrillers and mysteries and ghost stories. I love police procedurals. I don't know if I would ever have the ambition to do fantasy or sci-fi because that's pretty overwhelming. But there's a lot of other genres of fiction that I would like to try and always bring the literary bent to it. I don't think I'll ever be a true genre writer. I always strive to have literature be a part of what I do through character development and the quality of the prose. But a lot of writers do that. A lot of great writers who write literature write genre fiction, and they meld the two together. And so I want to try a whole bunch of different kinds.
Did you find that the characters ever surprised you? I love to ask fiction authors this. Like, did you think that Pat was going to zig and then he ended up zagging all of a sudden?
Not so much, and that's probably because I outline really carefully before I write. I know a lot of writers do not. I've heard the advice go both ways. So I'm not here trying to sell this to any aspiring writers that you have to outline. I mean, even when I was an editor and a teacher, I recommended it so that you could get an idea of where the story was going to go. You needed to have, at least for me, like a narrative blueprint for something this big that covers this much space. Because novels are really baggy creatures, and to be able to contain them is really difficult, especially if you're hoping to create a story where the pages are flying by and the readers keep flipping them over. So everything was pretty carefully outlined beforehand. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't be willing to go back and change something, because there were moments where I would have an outline, I was sticking to it, but then it didn't make sense for something I had written. I'd go through and I'd change the outline and I'd change the story.
Well, it certainly looks like an interesting book. I think everybody, if they're interested in this genre, should pick it up. Our guest has been Andrew Hillman. Andrew, I'm assuming you can get this book pretty much anywhere fine books are sold.
Yeah, you certainly can, to my knowledge, so wherever is convenient for anyone.
Well, thank you so much for being a part of the crime scene today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.